There's a specific kind of quiet that happens when a coffee shop closes. Not the loud, dramatic kind of business failure. No bankruptcy headline flashing across the news. Just a handwritten sign taped to a locked glass door, a regular customer standing outside confused at 6 a.m., and a drive-through lane that used to have a line wrapped around the building, now sitting completely empty. That quiet has been happening a lot lately. Not because coffee itself is going anywhere. Americans still drink more of it than almost any other country on earth. But because the specific business of getting people to walk through a door and pay for a cup somebody else made is turning out to be a lot harder to sustain than it used to be. The coffee's fine. In a lot of cases, the coffee is better than it's ever been. It's everything else around the coffee, the rent on the building, the staff behind the counter, the assumption that people will keep showing up out of habit. That's the part quietly falling apart. Today, we're breaking down 5 major American coffee chains that are struggling to survive right now, and one very different reason behind almost all of it. Here's a number that explains more about this list than any single company's balance sheet. According to the National Coffee Association and Mortar Intelligence, retail coffee sales meant for brewing at home, the bags and pods you buy at the grocery store, accounted for roughly 87% of all coffee sales in the United States in 2025. And that share is projected to keep growing. Americans didn't fall out of love with coffee. They just started making more of it themselves in their own kitchen, in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost of a daily trip through a drive-thru. That shift sounds small when you say it out loud. More people brewing at home, but multiplied across tens of millions of households and stretched out over years. It quietly pulls the floor out from under any coffee chain whose entire business depends on convincing someone that today, specifically, is a day worth leaving the house for a cup they could have made themselves. Number 5. Compass Coffee. Compass Coffee built a loyal following in Washington, D.C. by doing something most large chains stopped doing years ago, roasting its own beans in-house and leaning hard into a local, community-focused identity. In late 2025, Compass Coffee agreed to vacate its D.C. roastery facility and indicated in court filings that it might file for bankruptcy protection by the end of the year. For a chain that built its entire brand around being the opposite of a faceless national coffee giant, the roastery closure hits differently than a single storefront shutting down. The roastery wasn't just a business asset. It was the physical proof of Compass Coffee's whole pitch to customers that this was coffee made close to home, by people who cared about the process. Losing that facility strikes at the exact thing that was supposed to set the chain apart from Starbucks in the first place. There's a particular kind of financial trap that specialty, craft-focused chains fall into more than their bigger competitors. Roasting your own beans, sourcing directly, building a genuinely local identity, all of that costs significantly more than simply buying pre-roasted product at scale the way a national chain can. Customers say they want that authenticity, and many of them mean it. But authenticity has a price tag that doesn't always survive contact with a slower month of sales. Number 4. Clutch Coffee Bar. Clutch Coffee Bar spent 8 years building a fast-growing chain of small drive-through coffee stands across North and South Carolina, exactly the kind of quick, convenient format that was supposed to be the future of coffee retail. On January 14, 2026, Clutch announced it had been acquired by Dutch Bros, and just 2 days later, on January 16th, all 20 of its locations closed at 4 p.m. on the same day. There was no long wind down, no farewell tour. Customers were simply directed to a mobile app to find out when a rebranded version of their old coffee stand might reopen. What makes Clutch's story different from almost everything else on this list is that it wasn't really a failure story at all. The chain was growing steadily for 8 straight years. It got acquired specifically because it was working, but even a genuinely successful regional coffee chain wasn't big enough on its own to survive independently in a market where a larger, better-funded competitor can simply buy the whole operation and absorb it overnight. For customers, the practical experience looks identical, whether a chain closes because it failed or because it succeeded well enough to get bought out. Either way, the coffee stand they used to stop at every morning is suddenly gone, replaced by a construction fence and a QR code pointing them toward an app owned by a company they've never heard of. Number 3. Caribou Coffee. Caribou Coffee built its brand around a cozy, cabin-style atmosphere that felt like a deliberate alternative to the more corporate, minimalist feel of Starbucks. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, Caribou has been closing individual locations across multiple states, from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, to Merriam, Kansas, to Rochester, Minnesota, where the chain's longtime shop near the Mayo Clinic went dark, leaving the city with just 12 remaining locations. Some of these closures come with a specific local explanation: a redevelopment project, a construction disruption, a lease ending. But taken together, the pattern points to something bigger than any single lease. Caribou has occasionally opened new locations in the same period, including a new store planned in Olathe, Kansas, which shows this isn't a company disappearing outright. It's a company that's become far more selective about which specific corners of which specific cities are still worth the cost of keeping a coffee shop open, and increasingly willing to walk away from locations that don't clearly earn their keep. That kind of location by location math is a very different strategy than the sweeping, all at once bankruptcy filings that dominate headlines. It's slower, quieter, and in some ways harder to notice happening at all, one lease decision at a time, spread out across a dozen different cities, until enough of them add up that a longtime customer in any one of those towns eventually realizes their regular stop simply isn't there anymore. Number 2. Peet's Coffee. Peet's opened its very first location in Berkeley, California back in 1966, and for decades it was considered one of the original pioneers of American specialty coffee, the chain that predates Starbucks itself, and helped define what a serious coffee shop was even supposed to taste like. But in January 2026, Peet's confirmed it would close a number of locations across its system, with reports indicating 27 of its 283 stores were slated to shut down. The closures hit the San Francisco Bay Area particularly hard, including long-running locations in Berkeley, Manhattan Beach, and Redondo Beach, along with a store in Evanston, Illinois that had built such a devoted following that customers organized a petition trying to save it. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The closures came as Peet's parent company, JDE Peet's, agreed to an $18 billion acquisition by Keurig Dr. Pepper, a deal the company said required aligning the business with, in their words, long-term growth priorities and current market conditions. For a chain that spent 60 years building a reputation on craftsmanship and quality roasting, watching it get folded into a beverage conglomerate, best known for K-Cup pods, is its own quiet kind of irony. The union representing workers at one of the affected Berkeley locations said publicly that management hadn't met what they considered its legal obligation to negotiate over the impact of the closures, adding a labor dispute on top of an already emotional set of shutdowns for a brand whose entire identity was built on being more thoughtful and more community-rooted than its bigger rivals. Number 1. Starbucks. Starbucks isn't just the biggest coffee chain in America. For a lot of people, it basically is what the words coffee shop mean: the default answer to where you meet a friend, where you go to get work done, where you stop on the way to anywhere. Which makes it especially significant that Starbucks closed 400 store locations in 2025 alone, while also laying off 900 corporate employees as part of what the company has publicly called a turnaround plan. Unlike Compass Coffee or Clutch, Starbucks isn't in any danger of going out of business. It remains enormously profitable and is currently in the middle of a plan to remodel 1,000 of its remaining locations at a cost of roughly $150,000 per store by the end of 2026, investing heavily in the stores it's keeping, even while cutting the ones it isn't. Research cited alongside the closures found that half of all Starbucks customers regularly buy coffee from other places too, meaning even the most dominant coffee brand in the country can no longer assume customer loyalty translates into a guaranteed daily visit. When the single most recognizable coffee company on the planet is closing hundreds of stores while simultaneously admitting its own customers are splitting their business elsewhere, that's not a story about Starbucks failing. It's a story about what it now takes just to hold onto a market that used to feel unshakable. Starbucks' own loyalty data actually tells an interesting parallel story. Loyalty program members spend roughly 3 times more than non-members, and now account for 41% of all U.S. sales, growing at more than 13% year over year. In other words, Starbucks isn't losing its most devoted customers at all. It's losing the much larger group of casual, occasional visitors who used to wander in without thinking twice. And closing hundreds of stores is the company's way of admitting that maintaining a location for that increasingly rare casual walk-in customer no longer pencils out the way it once did. Now here's the part of this story that complicates the simple narrative of decline. While Compass, Clutch, Caribou, and Pete's have all been shrinking, Dutch Bros has been doing the opposite, expanding aggressively and specifically buying up struggling regional competitors like Clutch Coffee Bar to convert their locations into new Dutch Bros stores. Dutch Bros built its entire model around speed and a drive-through first format with almost no seating and minimal real estate overhead. Exactly the kind of lean, low-cost operation that doesn't depend on customers lingering inside a cafe for hours. That's turning out to be a meaningful advantage at the exact moment when fewer people want to sit inside a coffee shop at all. Where a traditional cafe has to pay for tables, chairs, indoor seating space, and staff to keep that dining room clean and welcoming for hours at a time, a Dutch Bros location can serve nearly the same volume of customers out of a building, a fraction of the size, with a fraction of the overhead, built around a transaction that's designed to take less than a minute from order to drive away. Looking back at this whole list, the pattern across the American coffee industry looks less like people falling out of love with coffee and more like people falling out of love with the specific ritual of leaving the house to get it. The chains struggling the most, Compass with its roastery, Pete's with its craftsmanship story, Caribou with its cozy cabin feel, all built their identity around an in-person experience worth lingering in. The chains still expanding, Dutch Bros with its drive-through speed, are betting on the opposite idea, that coffee has become less about the place and more about the 5 minutes it takes to grab it and go. For an industry that spent decades competing over who could build the most inviting room to sit in, the room itself might be the thing customers are increasingly willing to skip entirely. That's a strange thing for an industry to confront. For most of modern coffee culture, the entire pitch, going back to the earliest days of the specialty coffee boom, was that the shop itself was the product just as much as the drink. A place worth paying extra for, worth sitting in, worth building a morning routine around. What this list suggests is that fewer people are buying that pitch than they used to, not because the coffee got worse, but because staying home or driving through quietly became good enough. Is there a coffee shop on this list you used to stop at regularly? Or one still going strong near you? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how this looks where you live.